Lesson 2 setup. We're going to look at the setup of the Pycom device and the software. Let's jump directly into it. This is what we're going to do today, and then connect the device and try let it communicate with your computer. And well, you see the USB cable here. Just short mentioning of the antennas. It's recommended that before you send anything on the LoRa or Sigfox, you should have attached an antenna. And if you're unsure of this, you can remove the RTS, CTS jumper cables as shown, and then it should not transmit, but please just attach the antenna and it's no problem. Short about the expansion board. The expansion board is the way that we're going to connect our low-pi device or 5-pi device to the computer. It has a micro SD card reader and writer, so you can log data, you can write and read data directly to the micro SD card from your board, so the device can actually be used as a logger and not only a wireless transmission device. And then you can put your low-pi obviously, and then connect or it exposes all your pins in a neat way. You can see the jumper cables pointed out where you have some functionality of turning off or turning on the battery charging, etc. The expansion board has a built-in battery charger, so if you have a rechargeable battery, this can be used for charging up the battery. And not to forget the USB port, which we are going to connect to both power the device and also communicate with the device. I must mention, be very gentle with the USB connector. I've broken at least one of these expansion board's USB connectors when, well, I was a bit harsh perhaps. And then it becomes tricky if you want to connect it to a USB cable. So try to be gentle. Don't use any force. And my advice is that you don't disconnect and connect the micro USB port on the expansion board more than needed. If you want to disconnect and connect the device, do it on the other end and on your computer with the USB A end instead. So try to keep as little strain on that micro USB port as possible. In that case, you might not have to order yet another one just to finish your project. And you can find all the data sheets and specifications on the expansion board on Pycom's website. As I said earlier, this is more a way of exposing the pinouts. Obviously, you need to do a correct mounting of the low-pi device on board the expansion board. It can only go one way, and all pins should be in its respective place. If you mount it the wrong way, and yeah, I have tried it, it doesn't seem to break anything, but it says in the manual and the documentation that it's not recommended, so I won't recommend it either. Put it the right way, just directly, and it will make a lot of things easier. It might be that you need to update the firmware. If you need to update the firmware, which I don't think, because and now we're talking about the firmware of the expansion board. So the expansion board firmware. The low-pi, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but the expansion board also has a firmware. And they should be updated, but you need to read up on how to update the firmware. And if you're unsure if you have any problems, this is a way that, well, at least we can start to update the firmware, so we know that. The documentation on how to update the firmware is found on the PyCom website. We'll talk about this on more specifically during one of the live workshops, which are going to be held by our great teaching assistants. Be a little bit careful when you do this, so you don't mess things up, because what you're doing now is flashing the bootloader of the expansion board. So if you get a power short out, well, something happens during just that exact moment. It might be tricky to get things working again. I'm saying might. I'm not sure. If you by any chance still are running Windows 7, well, you should not. So let's start with that. Try to upgrade your operating system and to something more modern. Maybe a Unix-based system, or worst case, Windows 10. But just mentioning that Windows 7, you need to find drivers for Windows 7. So if you're on Windows 7, you'll have to go and download drivers and make them work. If you're on Windows 10, if you're on Mac OS or on Linux, it should work right out of the box. But the older operating systems might need drivers. Updating the firmware. And now we're talking about the firmware of the low-pi device, the actual microcontroller. There are a lot of different versions of firmware, but you can find the PyCom firmware updater on the PyCom website. It's a small program, you download it to your computer, and that's about it. It's very easy to get going, and you connect your device with USB, and well, here's the thing: if the expansion board firmware isn't updated, then this might have a problem working. So you'll probably just notice that right away if it's not updated, if you can't update the low-pi firmware. If this seems to work, well, don't bother about updating the expansion board firmware. But this is something that you will be doing more than once, because it might be that you're testing a different firmware. There is a legacy firmware of MicroPython, and there is their PyCom's own PyBytes firmware. We'll dive into that a little bit later on. But you need to download the firmware update tool. And then we're going to set up the Pymakr IDE. And IDE is short for Integrated Development Environment. That's where you write your code and do all that. That's where you develop your project, more or less. And it can be used for writing code, and also in this case for communicating with your device, which is one of the great advantages with the PyCom devices, as I see it, is that you have this interactive interface with Python directly. So it's very quick and very easy to test out ideas and to run something. There are two IDEs, both of these are free. It's just a matter of choice. There are of course many more. I mean, some people use Vim, some people run Nano, some people use Visual Studio or Xcode, whatever. So there's a lot of different IDEs. But in this course, you can either choose Atom or VS Code, and that's because this Pymakr plugin is only compatible with either Atom or VS Code. So just choose either. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. They should be as updated, both plugins for this. I personally prefer Atom. Ask someone else and they might say, I prefer VS Code. And VS Code is actually one thing that Microsoft has managed to do good. I'm just saying. So, well, if you look at the Microsoft Teams application, maybe not one of the best things they've done, but well, VS Code, it's pretty good. But I prefer Atom. You just take a pick, try both, they're free, and they're not very heavy on your computer either. When you have installed Atom or Visual Studio Code, you go in and install a package called Pymakr. You find it under the I'll share the screen, and now we have my Atom editor open. I'll go up and check preferences, and then I'll jump to install. Now it's already installed, but I will see it anyway. You can see here that I have the Pymakr plugin to 2.1.5, and that's already installed, so well, it will look the same for you. When this is installed, you will get a new black REPL interface down below. So I'll just connect my PyCom device now, and you can see that something happened. I'll press the reset button, and you can see that I can now execute code directly. It wasn't supposed to be two pluses. I can execute code directly on the device via the REPL interface. We'll go into how more in detail how this works in just a little bit. And when you have installed this, it should be enough just connecting your device with USB, and you'll get the REPL interface. It might be that if you're on Windows, you might need Node.js, which is JavaScript on your computer. The Pymakr plugin uses Node.js for some parts of the communication. So if you're on a Linux or a Mac computer, in my experience, this is not needed. And if you're on a Windows machine, you have to download it. That's about it for this session.